Hotel on the Corner of Bitter and Sweet, Chapter 10, Lakeview. The year is 1986. Henry paid the bill and watched as his son waved goodbye, loading an enormous to-go bag into the front seat of his silver Honda Accord. The extra goodies had been at Henry's insistence. He knew his son did okay with the food on campus, but they didn't have anything that compared with a dozen fresh humbao. And besides, steamed pork buns could easily be reheated in the microwave in Marty's dorm room. Content that his son was well on his way, Henry stopped at a flower stand, then stood at the nearest bus stop, where he caught the number 10 to the far side of Capitol Hill, within walking distance of Lakeview Cemetery. When Ethel died, Henry had sworn he'd visit her grave once a week, but it had been 6 months now, and he'd been up to see her only once, on what would have been their 38th wedding anniversary. He placed fresh-cut starfire lilies, the kind they grew in their flower garden, on the small granite headstone that was all that reminded the world that Ethel had once lived. He paid his respects, sweeping away the dried leaves and wiping the moss from her grave, where he placed another small bundle of flowers, putting his umbrella away, and ignoring the fine Seattle mist. He opened his wallet and took out a small white envelope. On the front was the Chinese character for Li, Ethel's last name for the last 37 plus years. Inside had been a piece of hard candy and a quarter. The small envelopes were passed out as he left the Bonnie Watson funeral home, where Ethel's memorial service had been held. The candy was so that everyone leaving would taste sweetness. The quarter was for buying more candy on the way home, a traditional token of lasting life and enduring happiness. Henry remembered savoring the candy, a small peppermint, but he didn't feel like stopping at the store on the way home. Marty, ironically, argued that they honor this tradition, but Henry refused. "Take me home, take me home," was all he said when Marty slowed down near the Southgate grocery. Henry couldn't bear the thought of spending that quarter. That was all he had left of Ethel. His enduring happiness would have to wait. He'd save it, keeping it with him always. He thought about that happiness, reaching into the small envelope he carried with him every day, drawing out the quarter. It was unremarkable, a normal coin anyone would spend on a phone call or a cup of bad coffee. But to Henry, it was a promise of something better. Henry remembered the day of Ethel's service. He'd arrived early to meet with Clarence Ma, the funeral director assigned to his family, a kindly man in his 60s, prone to talking about his own bodily ailments. Clarence was the patron saint of all things funerary when it came to Chinatown. Each neighborhood had its own advocate. The stately walls of the Bonnie Watson funeral home were covered with their framed photos, a United Nations of ethically diverse funeral directors. "Henry, you're early. Something I can do for you?" Clarence said, looking up from his desk, where he'd been stuffing the coins and candy into envelopes as Henry walked by. "Just wanted to check the flowers," Henry replied, heading into the chapel, where a large portrait of Ethel sat surrounded by flower arrangements of various sizes. Clarence caught up to him, placing his arm on his shoulder. Beautiful, isn't it? Henry nodded. We made sure to place your flowers right next to her picture. She was a lovely woman, Henry. I'm sure she's in a happier place, but hardly one as beautiful. Clarence handed Henry a small white envelope. In case you don't remember after the service. Take it, just in case. Henry felt the quarter inside. He held the envelope to his nose and could smell the peppermint among the wet, fragrant scents of the floral-filled room. Thank you, was all he could muster. Now, standing in the misty rain of Lakeview Cemetery, Henry touched the envelope to his nose again. He couldn't smell a thing. I'm sorry I haven't been here as often as I should have. He apologized. He held the quarter in his hand, putting the envelope in his pocket. He listened to the sound of the wind blowing through the trees, never really expecting an answer, but always open to the possibility. I have some things I need to do, and, well, I just wanted to come by and tell you first. But you probably know all this. Henry's attention drifted to the market next to Ethel's. It was his parents. Then he looked back to where Ethel lay. You always knew me so well. Henry brushed the graying hair from his temples, wet from the drizzly rain. I'm getting by, but I'm worried about Marty. I've always worried about him. I guess I'd ask that you look out for him. Me? I can look out for myself. I'll be okay. Henry looked around to see if anyone might be watching him having this odd, one-way conversation. He was all alone. He wasn't even sure if Ethel was listening. It was one thing to talk to her at home, where she lived, but out here, in the cold ground next to his parents, she was certainly gone. Still, Henry had needed to come out to say goodbye. He kissed the quarter and placed it on top of Ethel's headstone. This was our promise of happiness, Henry thought. It's all I have left to give. This is so you can be happy without me. He stood back, hands at his sides, and took 3 deep bows out of respect. I have to go now, Henry said. Before he left, he drew a lily from Ethel's bundle of flowers and set it on his mother's grave. He even brushed a few leaves from his father's stone before opening his umbrella and walking back down the hill in the direction of Volunteer Park. He took the long way back, down a winding path that led to the near-empty parking lot. Lakeview Cemetery was a beautiful place, despite the somber graves that stood as cold reminders of so much loss and longing. The final resting place of Chief Seattle's daughter and other notables, like Asa Mercer and Henry Yelsler. It was a walking tour of Seattle's forgotten history, not unlike the Nisei War Memorial Monument in the northeast corner. It was a smaller monument, smaller than the headstones of members of the Nordstrom family, dedicated to Japanese-American veterans, locals who died fighting the Germans. These days, it went all but unnoticed, except by Henry, who tipped his hat as he slowly walked by.